The weekend brought an uneasy calm to Millbrook, but Sarah could feel the undercurrents of tension flowing beneath the surface. Mrs. Henderson and her allies had not given up their campaign, they had simply changed tactics. Instead of direct confrontation, they began a more subtle form of pressure, organizing boycotts and social exclusion aimed at anyone who showed Sarah any kindness. Murphy felt the pressure almost immediately. Several prominent families stopped frequenting his saloon, and he received stern warnings about the consequences of employing unsuitable people. The loss of business worried him, but he seemed determined to stand by his decision to keep Sarah employed, perhaps influenced by the deputy's example of moral courage. Dr. Williams also found himself targeted after he was seen speaking politely to Sarah when she brought Tommy for a minor injury. The town's leading families began questioning his judgment and suggesting that perhaps they needed a physician who better understood community standards. The doctor, however, refused to be intimidated and continued treating Tommy when needed. Sarah watched these developments with growing guilt and anxiety. She hadn't wanted anyone else to suffer because of her presence in town, and the knowledge that good people were being punished for showing her basic human decency weighed heavily on her conscience. She began seriously considering whether leaving might be the best solution for everyone involved. The deputy, whose name she had learned was Jake Morrison, continued his regular rounds and maintained a professional distance from the conflict while making it clear that he would not tolerate any illegal harassment. His presence seemed to prevent the situation from escalating into outright violence, but it couldn't stop the social and economic pressure being applied by the town's elite. On Monday morning, Sarah arrived at work to find Murphy in deep conversation with two men she didn't recognize. They were well-dressed and carried themselves with the authority of people accustomed to getting their way. As she began her morning tasks, she could hear fragments of their conversation about business partnerships and community investments. The men left after about an hour, but Murphy remained troubled for the rest of the day. He was shorter with customers than usual and seemed lost in thought during quiet moments. Sarah suspected that the visitors had delivered some kind of ultimatum related to her employment, though Murphy said nothing to her directly. That afternoon brought unexpected developments when a stagecoach arrived carrying 3 passengers who would change the dynamic in Millbrook completely. The first was a territorial judge who had come to investigate reports of corruption in the previous administration. The second was a newspaper reporter from the territorial capital who was writing about law enforcement in frontier towns. The third passenger was the most surprising of all. She was an elderly woman named Elizabeth Hartwell, the widow of a prominent territorial politician who had died the previous year. Mrs. Hartwell had known Sarah's late husband and had come to Millbrook specifically to find Sarah and offer her assistance. Mrs. Hartwell's arrival sent shockwaves through the town's social hierarchy. She was exactly the kind of prominent, respectable figure that Mrs. Henderson and her allies claimed to represent, but her support for Sarah completely undermined their arguments about moral standards and community values. The elderly woman took rooms at the boarding house and immediately requested a meeting with Sarah. When they met that evening, Mrs. Hartwell explained that Sarah's husband had saved her son's life during a cavalry action several years earlier. She had been searching for Sarah ever since learning of her husband's death, wanting to repay the debt she felt she owed to his family. Mrs. Hartwell listened carefully as Sarah told her the true story of how her husband had died and why she had been forced to flee their home. The older woman was outraged by the treatment Sarah had received in Millbrook and determined to set things right. Her first step was to arrange a public meeting where she could address the entire community. The meeting was held in the church on Wednesday evening, with virtually every adult in Millbrook in attendance. Mrs. Hartwell spoke with the authority of someone accustomed to addressing important gatherings, and her words carried weight that no one could ignore. She began by establishing her credentials and explaining her connection to Sarah's family. Then, she told the true story of Sarah's husband's heroism and sacrifice, painting a picture of a man who had died protecting others and deserved to be honored rather than have his widow and child persecuted. Mrs. Henderson and her supporters found themselves in an impossible position. They couldn't argue with someone of Mrs. Hartwell's stature without damaging their own reputations, but accepting her account meant admitting they had been wrong about Sarah. Several of them tried to maintain their position by questioning why Sarah hadn't told the truth from the beginning. Mrs. Hartwell addressed this concern directly, explaining the social realities that made it dangerous for women to be associated with any kind of violence, even as innocent victims. She pointed out that Sarah had been trying to protect herself and her son from exactly the kind of persecution she had received in Millbrook. Deputy Morrison had been present for the meeting, and, when Mrs. Hartwell finished speaking, he stood to address the crowd. He spoke about the importance of judging people by their actions rather than by gossip and assumptions. He reminded the audience that Sarah had worked hard, caused no trouble, and deserved the same chance for a fresh start that many of them had received when they first came to Millbrook. The judge also spoke, using the opportunity to deliver a broader message about justice and community responsibility. He emphasized that a town's strength came from how it treated its most vulnerable members, not from how effectively it excluded people who seemed different. The newspaper reporter took careful notes throughout the meeting, and his presence reminded everyone that their community's reputation might soon be known throughout the territory. The prospect of being portrayed as intolerant and unchristian in the territorial press was sobering for many who had supported the campaign against Sarah. By the end of the meeting, the tide of public opinion had clearly shifted. While some die-hard supporters of Mrs. Henderson remained unconvinced, the majority of the community seemed ready to accept Sarah as a legitimate member of their town. Several people even approached her after the meeting to apologize for their previous treatment. The next few days brought dramatic changes in Sarah's daily life. Children who had previously been forbidden to play with Tommy were suddenly allowed to include him in their games. Shopkeepers who had barely acknowledged her existence began greeting her politely and treating her like any other customer. Mrs. Patterson at the general store was particularly welcoming, finally, able to show the kindness she had felt all along without fear of social consequences. She helped Sarah shop for better clothes for herself and Tommy, extending credit that she might not have offered before Mrs. Hartwell's intervention. Deputy Morrison's role in defending Sarah had elevated his standing in the community among those who valued fairness and justice. While some resented his interference in what they saw as local matters, many others respected his principled stance and began to see him as exactly the kind of lawman their town needed. The changes weren't immediate or universal. Mrs. Henderson and her closest allies continued to disapprove of Sarah's presence, though they no longer had the social power to do anything about it. They maintained their distance and their disapproval, but they couldn't prevent others from accepting Sarah as part of the community. Mrs. Hartwell remained in Millbrook for 2 weeks, using her influence to help Sarah establish herself more securely in the town. She arranged for Sarah to receive training as a seamstress from the local dressmaker, providing her with skills that would allow her to earn better money and more respectable work. The elderly woman also set up a small trust fund for Tommy's education, ensuring that the boy would have opportunities that his mother's limited income couldn't provide. She made it clear that she considered this an honor debt that could never be fully repaid, given what Sarah's husband had sacrificed for her family. When Mrs. Hartwell finally prepared to leave, she organized one final gathering to formally introduce Sarah to the community as someone worthy of their respect and support. The event was held at the church again, but this time it was a celebration rather than a confrontation. Deputy Morrison attended the farewell gathering, and, as the evening concluded, he approached Sarah for a private conversation. He had been thinking about her situation and wanted to make sure she felt secure in her new status in the community. Their conversation was brief but significant, marking the beginning of a friendship based on mutual respect and shared values. Over the following months, Sarah's life in Millbrook continued to improve. Her work as a seamstress proved both profitable and socially acceptable, allowing her to move into a better living situation and provide Tommy with a more normal childhood. The boy thrived in his new environment, making friends and attending school like any other child in town. The relationship between Sarah and Deputy Morrison developed slowly and naturally. He would stop by her shop occasionally to check on her welfare, and she would sometimes prepare meals for him when his duties kept him working late. Their conversations revealed shared values and compatible personalities, though both were careful not to rush into anything that might cause new gossip. Mrs. Henderson eventually accepted the new reality, though she never completely forgave being proven wrong so publicly. She maintained a cool but civil relationship with Sarah, understanding that continued hostility would only damage her own standing in the community. The transformation of Sarah's status from outcast to accepted member of the community became a source of pride for many in Millbrook. They had learned an important lesson about the dangers of rushing to judgment and the value of giving people second chances. Deputy Morrison's handling of the situation enhanced his reputation throughout the territory. Word spread that Millbrook had a lawman who cared more about justice than about pleasing influential people, and his career prospects improved significantly as a result. A year after Mrs. Hartwell's visit, Sarah and Deputy Morrison began courting officially. Their relationship had grown naturally from mutual respect and shared experiences, and the community that had once shunned her now looked forward to welcoming her as the wife of their deputy sheriff. Tommy, who had suffered most from the early persecution, recovered completely from his traumatic introduction to Millbrook. He grew into a confident, well-adjusted boy who was popular with his classmates and respected by his teachers. The early lesson about standing up for what's right, learned by watching Deputy Morrison defend his mother, would serve him well throughout his life. The wedding of Sarah and Jake Morrison was one of the largest celebrations Millbrook had seen in years. Even Mrs. Henderson attended, having finally accepted that her initial judgment had been wrong. The ceremony represented not just the union of two people who had found love, but the triumph of justice and compassion over prejudice and fear. Mrs. Hartwell returned for the wedding, delighted to see how well her intervention had worked out for everyone involved. She had not only repaid her debt to Sarah's heroic husband but had helped create a stronger, more just community in the process. The story of Sarah and Deputy Morrison became part of Millbrook's local legend, told and retold as an example of what could happen when people chose courage over conformity and justice over gossip. It served as a reminder that sometimes the most unlikely circumstances can lead to the most beautiful outcomes, and that true character is revealed not by how people treat those with power and status, but by how they treat those who have neither. Friday morning arrived with an unusual bustle in the streets below Sarah's window. She could hear voices and footsteps earlier than normal, and when she peered through the curtains, she saw more people than usual moving about their business. The arrival of the new lawman had clearly energized the town, though Sarah suspected that energy would soon be directed toward removing unwanted elements like herself. She dressed Tommy carefully and prepared for what might be their last day in Millbrook. If the sheriff decided she needed to leave town, she wanted to be ready. She packed their few belongings into a small cloth bag and counted her saved money one more time. $14.37. It wasn't much, but it might be enough to get them to the next town if they were careful. At Murphy's saloon, the atmosphere was different than usual. The men who normally spent their mornings drinking coffee and playing cards were instead gathered around talking about the new deputy. Apparently, he had already made an impression during his evening rounds, stopping fights before they started and showing a combination of firmness and fairness that had surprised everyone. Murphy himself seemed pleased with the new law enforcement. He told Sarah that having capable lawmen in town would be good for business, as travelers would feel safer stopping in Millbrook. He didn't mention whether this change might affect her position, but Sarah could sense his nervousness whenever customers looked in her direction. Around mid-morning, the saloon doors swung open and the new deputy entered. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she got her first close look at the man who might decide her fate. He was indeed tall, probably in his early 30s, with sun-weathered skin and kind eyes that seemed to take in everything around him without judgment. His movements were careful and deliberate, like someone accustomed to dangerous situations. He ordered coffee and sat at a table where he could observe the entire room. Several of the regular customers approached him, clearly hoping to curry favor with the new authority figure. The deputy listened politely to their conversations but didn't seem particularly impressed by their attempts to influence him. Sarah continued washing dishes, trying to remain invisible while keeping one eye on the man who held so much power over her future. Tommy sat quietly in his corner, sensing the tension in the air even though he couldn't understand its source. The little boy had developed an uncanny ability to know when his mother was worried. After about an hour, the deputy finished his coffee and stood to leave. As he passed the kitchen area, he glanced toward Sarah, and their eyes met for just a moment. His expression was neutral, but not unkind. He touched the brim of his hat in a small gesture of acknowledgement before walking out the door. The rest of the morning passed slowly, with Sarah jumping at every sound that might indicate trouble approaching. But no one came to order her to leave town, and no angry crowd gathered outside. She began to hope that perhaps the new lawman had more important things to worry about than one struggling woman and her child. That hope was shattered when Mrs. Henderson arrived at the saloon just after noon, accompanied by 3 other prominent women from the town. They marched through the doors like an army on a mission, their faces set with determination and righteous anger. Murphy emerged from behind the bar, clearly uncomfortable with having respectable ladies in his establishment. Mrs. Henderson wasted no time getting to the point. She announced loudly that the Women's Committee had decided it was time to address the moral standards of Millbrook, now that proper law enforcement had arrived to support their efforts. They had come to inform Murphy that employing someone of questionable character was no longer acceptable in their community. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face as every person in the saloon turned to stare at her. Tommy sensed the hostility in the room and moved closer to his mother, wrapping his small arms around her leg. Murphy shifted nervously, clearly torn between keeping his employee and avoiding conflict with the town's most influential women. The deputy sheriff chose that moment to return to the saloon. He stepped through the doors just as Mrs. Henderson was reaching the climax of her speech about protecting the moral fiber of their community. The room fell silent as everyone turned to see how the new lawman would respond to this situation. Mrs. Henderson immediately shifted her attention to the deputy, explaining that they had been discussing the town's standards with the saloon owner. She made it clear that they expected his support in maintaining proper order and decency in Millbrook. Her tone suggested that his response would determine how the community judged his fitness for the job. The deputy listened quietly, his expression giving nothing away. When Mrs. Henderson finished speaking, he looked around the room, taking in the faces of the people watching this confrontation. His gaze lingered on Sarah for a moment, then moved to Tommy, who was partially hidden behind his mother's skirts. Instead of responding immediately to Mrs. Henderson's demands, the deputy asked Murphy for another cup of coffee. He sat down at the same table he had occupied earlier and gestured for the women to join him. Mrs. Henderson looked surprised but took a seat, clearly expecting him to agree with her position. The deputy began by acknowledging the women's concerns about maintaining community standards. He spoke respectfully but made it clear that as a law enforcement officer, his primary concern was whether anyone had broken any actual laws. He asked specific questions about what crimes had been committed and what evidence existed to support the accusations being made. Mrs. Henderson found herself struggling to answer these questions. She spoke about reputation and appearances, about the importance of moral example, but she couldn't point to any specific illegal actions. The deputy listened patiently, occasionally asking for clarification or more details about the allegations. As the conversation continued, it became clear that the deputy was not going to simply rubber stamp the committee's demands. He explained that in his experience, jumping to conclusions about people's character often led to injustice. He had seen too many situations where gossip and assumptions had ruined innocent lives. Sarah stood frozen in the kitchen, hardly daring to breathe as she listened to this unexpected turn of events. No one had ever defended her before, and she wasn't sure how to react to having someone in authority actually question the town's treatment of her. The deputy asked Murphy directly about Sarah's work performance and reliability. Murphy, clearly nervous about being put on the spot, admitted that she was a good worker who showed up on time and did her job well. He mentioned that she was quiet and kept to herself, never causing any trouble in his establishment. Mrs. Henderson interrupted to point out that the issue wasn't about work performance but about moral standards and community reputation. She emphasized that having questionable people in prominent positions sent the wrong message to children and visitors. The other women nodded vigorously in agreement. The deputy considered this argument carefully before responding. He pointed out that washing dishes in a saloon kitchen was hardly a prominent position, and that judging people based on rumors and speculation was a dangerous precedent for any community. He asked what evidence they had that Sarah was actually a bad influence on anyone. The conversation was interrupted when Tommy, frightened by the tension in the room, began to cry. Sarah immediately knelt down to comfort her son, whispering reassurances while trying to calm his fears. The sight of the distressed child seemed to affect everyone in the room, though in different ways. Mrs. Henderson seized on the moment to point out that children shouldn't be exposed to saloon environments, using this as further evidence that Sarah's situation was inappropriate. But the deputy seemed more concerned about the child's immediate welfare than about abstract moral principles. He stood up and approached Sarah and Tommy, moving slowly so as not to frighten the boy further. In a gentle voice, he asked Tommy his name and age, treating the child with the same respect he would show any other member of the community. Tommy, still clinging to his mother, shyly answered the questions. The deputy then asked Sarah directly about her situation. He wanted to know how long she had been in Millbrook, whether she had family elsewhere, and what her plans were for the future. His questions were factual rather than accusatory, focused on understanding her circumstances rather than judging her character. Sarah answered honestly, explaining about her husband's death and her need to find work to support her son. She didn't elaborate on the details of how her husband had died, but she spoke clearly about her desire to build a stable life for Tommy. Her voice remained steady despite the hostile audience. Mrs. Henderson tried to interrupt with more accusations and demands, but the deputy raised his hand for silence. He explained that he needed to hear all sides of any situation before making decisions. His calm authority was more effective than any shouting could have been. After questioning Sarah, the deputy turned his attention back to the Women's Committee. He acknowledged their concerns about community standards but pointed out that driving away hard-working people based on gossip and assumptions was not the way to build a strong town. He suggested that perhaps the community would be better served by finding ways to support people who were trying to improve their circumstances. The suggestion clearly shocked Mrs. Henderson and her supporters. They had expected automatic agreement with their position, not a lecture about tolerance and understanding. Several of the women began talking at once, trying to regain control of the conversation and reinforce their demands. The deputy waited for them to finish before speaking again. He made it clear that while he respected their right to their opinions, he would not use his authority to force people out of town based on unproven allegations. His job was to enforce the law, not to act as a moral arbiter for the community. Mrs. Henderson's face reddened with anger and embarrassment. She had publicly aligned herself with what she thought would be the winning side, only to find herself challenged by the very person she had expected to support her. She gathered her supporters and marched out of the saloon, making dark promises about taking the matter up with the sheriff himself. After the women left, the saloon gradually returned to its normal atmosphere, though everyone continued to watch the deputy carefully. He finished his coffee and prepared to leave, but before going, he approached Sarah one more time. In a quiet voice, he told her that while he couldn't control what people thought or said, he could ensure that no laws were broken in pressuring her to leave town. He advised her to continue doing her job well and to let him know if anyone threatened her or her son. Then, he touched his hat again and walked out, leaving Sarah stunned by this unexpected protection. The rest of the day passed in a daze for Sarah. Word of the confrontation spread quickly through town, with different versions of the story circulating depending on who was telling it. Some people were angry that their community leaders had been challenged, while others seemed relieved that someone was willing to stand up for fairness and due process. Murphy was clearly shaken by the events but didn't fire Sarah. If anything, he seemed more protective of her than before, perhaps impressed by the deputy's defense of her right to work. He made sure she and Tommy had enough to eat and even gave her a small advance on her wages. That evening, as Sarah tucked Tommy into bed, she felt a mixture of gratitude and anxiety about what had happened. The deputy's intervention had saved her job for now, but she knew that Mrs. Henderson and her supporters wouldn't give up easily. The battle for her right to stay in Millbrook was far from over. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Millbrook as Sarah clutched her 3-year-old son Tommy closer to her chest. The whispers followed her everywhere she went, like tumbleweeds rolling behind her in the desert wind. Women pulled their children away when she passed, and men tipped their hats but avoided her eyes completely. Sarah had arrived in Millbrook 6 months ago with nothing but the clothes on her back, a crying baby, and a story that nobody wanted to believe. She claimed her husband had died in a mining accident 2 towns over, leaving her with no family and no money. But Millbrook was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and strangers were viewed with suspicion, especially women traveling alone with children. Mrs. Henderson, the baker's wife, was the worst of them all. She made sure everyone in town knew that Sarah had no wedding ring, no marriage certificate, and no proof of her husband's death. The rumors spread like wildfire through the small community. Some said she was running from the law. Others whispered she was an unmarried woman who had shamed herself and now sought to start fresh where nobody knew her past. The only job Sarah could find was washing dishes at Murphy's Saloon, a place where respectable women never set foot. The pay was barely enough to rent a tiny room above the general store, and she had to bring Tommy with her to work because nobody in town would watch him. The child would sit quietly in the corner of the kitchen, playing with wooden spoons and empty tin cans while his mother scrubbed plates and glasses until her hands were raw. Every morning, Sarah walked through town to buy bread and milk for Tommy, and every morning she endured the cold stares and hushed conversations. The children in town had learned from their parents to stay away from the strange woman and her boy. Tommy would reach out to other children his age, wanting to play, but they would run away or their mothers would quickly pull them aside. Mrs. Patterson, who ran the general store, was one of the few people who showed Sarah any kindness, though even she was careful not to be too friendly in public. She would sometimes slip an extra apple into Sarah's small bag of groceries or give Tommy a piece of candy when no one was looking. But she never defended Sarah against the gossip, too afraid of becoming an outcast herself. The loneliness was crushing. Sarah had grown up in a loving family back east, surrounded by sisters and cousins who helped care for each other's children. She had never imagined she would find herself so completely alone, so utterly rejected by an entire community. At night, after Tommy fell asleep, she would sit by the small window in their room and cry silently, wondering if she had made the right decision in coming to this place. The truth was more complicated than what she had told the people of Millbrook. Her husband had indeed died, but not in a mining accident. He had been killed during a bank robbery gone wrong, shot down in the street while trying to protect the money he had just withdrawn to buy supplies for their farm. The shock and grief had overwhelmed Sarah, and, when creditors came to take everything they owned, she had fled with Tommy, hoping to find somewhere they could start over. But she couldn't tell people the real story. In those days, being associated with any kind of violence or crime, even as a victim, could ruin a person's reputation forever. So she had invented the mining accident, thinking it would gain her sympathy. Instead, her inability to provide details that satisfied the townspeople's curiosity had only made them more suspicious. Dr. Williams, the town physician, had examined Tommy once when the boy had a fever, and he had quietly told Sarah that her son was healthy and well cared for. He could see that despite their poverty, she was a good mother who put her child's needs before her own. But even the doctor kept his opinions to himself, unwilling to challenge the social order of Millbrook. The worst part was watching Tommy suffer because of her situation. The little boy was naturally cheerful and social, but he was beginning to withdraw, sensing that something was wrong even though he couldn't understand what. He had stopped trying to approach other children and instead clung to his mother's skirts whenever they went outside. Sarah began to consider leaving Millbrook and trying their luck somewhere else, but she had no money for travel and nowhere to go. Winter was coming, and she knew that Tommy needed stability, not another long journey to an uncertain future. She felt trapped between staying in a place where they were unwanted and risking their lives on the road with no destination in mind. One evening, as she was finishing her work at the saloon, she overheard two ranchers talking about the need for workers during the upcoming cattle drive. They mentioned good pay for anyone willing to make the dangerous journey, but quickly dismissed the idea when they saw her listening. Women weren't welcome on cattle drives, especially women with children and questionable reputations. The next morning brought news that would change everything in Millbrook. A telegram arrived announcing that a new sheriff was coming to town, and with him would come his deputy, a man known throughout the territory for his skill with both horses and guns. The previous sheriff had died of a heart attack, and the town had been without proper law enforcement for months. People gathered in front of the telegraph office, excited to hear details about their new protectors. The sheriff was reportedly a fair but tough man who had cleaned up several lawless towns. His deputy was younger, a cowboy who had earned his reputation during the Indian Wars and later as a peacekeeper in the rough mining camps to the north. Sarah listened from a distance, holding Tommy's hand as the townspeople chatted excitedly about the arrival of the new lawman. She wondered if their presence would make life better or worse for her. Sometimes new authority figures brought positive change, but sometimes they simply reinforced the existing power structures that kept people like her at the bottom. As she walked home that evening, she noticed several of the town's prominent citizens meeting outside the bank. They were clearly discussing something important, gesturing toward her as she passed. Mrs. Henderson's voice carried on the evening air as she spoke about the need to maintain proper standards in their community now that respectable law enforcement was coming to town. Sarah quickened her pace, pulling Tommy along as the group's attention focused on her. She could feel their eyes boring into her back as she hurried toward the general store and the narrow stairway that led to her small room. Whatever they were planning, she knew it wouldn't be good for her and Tommy. That night, she lay awake planning what she would do if the town decided to force her to leave. She had saved a few dollars from her wages, but it wasn't nearly enough for passage on the stagecoach or supplies for travel. The idea of walking out into the wilderness with a small child terrified her, but staying might not be an option much longer. The next few days passed quietly, but Sarah could sense tension building in the town. People seemed more watchful, more deliberate in their actions. She caught fragments of conversations about cleaning up the town and making sure everything was respectable for the new sheriff's arrival. The meaning was clear even if no one said it directly. On Thursday afternoon, as Sarah was hanging laundry behind the general store, she saw dust clouds on the horizon indicating approaching riders. Word spread quickly through the streets that the new lawmen were arriving earlier than expected. People emerged from their businesses and homes, forming a welcoming committee in the center of town. Sarah gathered her wet clothes and retreated to her room with Tommy, not wanting to be part of the spectacle. From her window, she could see the crowd gathering below as two men on horseback rode slowly down the main street. The sheriff was an older man with gray hair and a serious expression, sitting straight in his saddle despite his age. His deputy was younger and rode with the easy confidence of someone who had spent his life on horseback. Even from a distance, Sarah could see that he was tall and lean, with the weathered look of a man who worked outdoors. He tipped his hat to the ladies in the crowd and nodded respectfully to the men who had gathered to greet them. The formal introductions and speeches seemed to go on forever, with various town leaders making lengthy presentations about Millbrook's history and values. Sarah couldn't hear the specific words, but she could sense the self-importance and pomposity in their voices. These were people who took themselves very seriously and expected others to do the same. As evening approached and the crowd began to disperse, Sarah saw Mrs. Henderson and several other prominent women approaching the sheriff and his deputy. They spoke in hushed tones, occasionally glancing up toward Sarah's window. She stepped back from the glass, her heart racing as she realized they were almost certainly discussing her situation. The conversation lasted several minutes, with much gesturing and serious nodding. Sarah watched the deputy's face carefully, trying to gauge his reaction to whatever he was being told. His expression remained neutral, giving no indication of his thoughts about the matter being discussed. Finally, the group broke up, with the sheriff and deputy heading toward the boarding house where they would be staying. Sarah closed the curtains and began preparing Tommy for bed, wondering what the morning would bring. She had a feeling that her time in Millbrook was about to come to an end, one way or another.